What to expect from Ben Simmons' defense this season? Who is Yuta Watanabe? And I visit with Jackson Gatlin from Locked On NBA to talk about the end of the KD trade saga, at least for now. It's all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie, owner-operator, DFSR.com. Got you covered for all of your daily fantasy projections for FanDuel and or DraftKings or Yahoo as well. You go to visit DFSR.com to get you covered over there. No Adam Armbrecht on the podcast today as we still roll through the summer schedule. I'm coming after a week off that turned out to not really be a week off because Kevin Durant rescinded the trade package. And sometimes even when you're about to go, rescinded the trade demand, sometimes when you're about to even go away with the wife and kids there for a few days, when something big happens in Nets world, you drop everything, you drop the bags, you tell the car to wait, you jump on the podcast and you make sure that it gets covered. But otherwise, enjoyed a nice little week away, back in the saddle now as Adam will be back later on this week. That's Adam Armbrecht. He's the host of the One Giant podcast. You know him covering all your stuff for the Giants. So as we roll through the summer, we're through the Kevin Durant piece. Obviously, Adam caught up with the Brooklyn Glue guys last week to talk about a lot of that stuff. We'll be talking in and out about some of this, how this summer unfolded and where we are now. But we can kind of start finally sort of dreaming on what the Nets are going to become this season, like what the Nets in their perfect form, in the form that we imagined as team run it back, wanted them to look like, with the core of Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and Ben Simmons, and then the pieces that they have around those guys. One of the frustrating things around this team during all this trade demand stuff was, they'll just imagine what they can look like if he just wants to come back and play. And we can never totally get there because when your superstar wants to be traded, it's like almost doesn't make sense to enter that brain space because it's just going to be another massive disappointment if the trade ends up going and you're going to go think about, how the team shakes out otherwise. But then that's kind of sports. Like that's the nature of sports and what it's been like to follow any team is like, what's it going to look like now? What could it look like later? Is this the perfect version we have now or will a trade make us better or worse and whatever? But we haven't really been able to get into that space because we've been waiting for the Kevin Durant kind of stuff to at least finalize or, come to some kind of agreement, trade, stay, whatever it ends up being. But we're definitely there now, at least for the time being, as we head into training camp. So we can start thinking about what this is going to become. And one of the things I wanted to talk about was Ben Simmons and starting to envision what it's going to look like. We started getting there last season, wanting to see what it was going to look like. Never actually got there with him getting onto the court because he never ends up getting onto the court. But by all accounts, right now, he's healthy. He's training in the offseason. And I wanted to just kind of dive in a little bit to what the defense is going to mean for him and what it's going to mean to have him as a primary defender on this team. Because as all the things that Ben Simmons brings to the table, ball handling, vision, size, and getting to the rim, which he can do really well. Like he can take advantage of mismatches. We also know the things he can't do very well, like shoot. The 3-pointers and all that other stuff is well documented. The free throw shooting is well documented. The passing up wide open dunks in high leverage playoff games is something we've heard about and seen about forever now. But and it's not like it gets forgotten. But remember, this guy, as much as anything else in his game, was making his bones on the defensive end and what he was able to do with the Sixers. It's forgotten a little bit now because he's been dragged maybe something rightfully and some, stuff that's out of his control a little bit. But we are a full season now removed from having him play basketball. But this was a guy in the defensive player of the year sort of discussion and, in just the actual voting of it, in terms of just like what he brought on the defensive end I'm going to give some defensive stats here. And I totally get that defensive stats when they come to the box score are not the be all end all. It's one of those things that is sometimes difficult to quantify, sometimes not that difficult to quantify, just because you can tell someone's really, really good at defense. And sometimes those things translate. Sometimes the stats don't necessarily translate 1-to-1, even though when we know guys are elite defenders, or sometimes they're overweighted for big men and centers. And that's just the nature of the way defensive stats bear out. But when you look at where Simmons has fallen when he was at least at the kind of the peak of his powers when it came to defense, when the Sixers 2 years ago had one of the best defenses in the league. They were number 2 overall in defensive efficiency behind only the Lakers that year. Remember, the Lakers were rolling with LeBron and AD, and then they were playing a big along with it. And they were really, this is the 2021 year. They were really, really tough to stop. The Sixers sat at number 2. That year, Simmons, if you look at where he landed just in terms of defensive win shares, he was 9th in defensive win shares. He was 8th in defensive box plus minus, and he was 5th overall in defensive rating. Again, usually stats that go to bigs on a team. So defensive rating that year was Rudy Gobert, Nerlens Noel was 2nd, Joel Embiid was 3rd, LeBron was 4th, Ben Simmons was 5th. And you're like, okay, well, this is awesome. These defensive numbers obviously look as good as any other guy in the league. And that's true. Simmons is a very, very good defender. He's an excellent on-ball defender. He is very good at he can guard lots of different positions. He generates lots of chaos on the defensive end. He was among the league leaders in steals. And one thing I got pushback on from some folks was, that was all Joel Embiid. Joel Embiid is what enabled Simmons's box score, defensive box scores, to look so good. That is true. That if you look at some of the other guys that are on this list, in the top 20, among the other box score plus minus guys, not box score plus minus, defensive win shares, that same season, Tobias Harris and Danny Green are 15 and 16. Okay. Why is that the case? Because Tobias Harris and Danny Green among the best defenders in the league? No. Danny Green's an excellent transition defender, but are those guys? No, but it was mostly a situation where we had guys who were playing all together great as a defensive unit. So the defensive stats are all going to help each other. And that's the same thing when it comes to defensive, box plus minus and defensive rating as well. Tobias Harris was 14th that season. I said that Simmons was 5th. Danny Green was 11th and Tobias Harris was 14th. Those guys played a ton of minutes together and the defense was amazing when they were all playing together. So they're all going to rank really high. Now, it's funny about that. Do we look at that as a knock on Simmons, or do we look at that a positive on Simmons? This is where I think there probably is going to end up being some disagreement. Is it that Simmons, his defensive prowess was a byproduct of, just having Embiid on the court with him, and so that everyone helped each other? Or was it that Simmons helped Embiid? We can make a case for that. Or was it just that this unit was so great and they played so many minutes together that everyone, rising tide in this case, sort of raised all ships? And that is what it looked like on the defensive end. I think kind of all these things end up being true. I don't think you can ding Simmons' defensive ability just because he happened to play with Embiid. And if you wanted to do the same thing to Embiid going back the other way with Simmons, no one does that as much, I don't think. So I don't think you're at risk of having that happen as much. But it's not Ben Simmons' fault that he played with Joel Embiid. You could complement them both by just anchoring one of the best defenses in the league when they all played together. That's a compliment for both. It's not a detraction from one and a help to the other, even if you think that Embiid's presence was more important than Simmons. And I think you can make that case, but there's clear evidence that they both helped each other. It's not just this, when you have Joel Embiid, everyone will look better defensively by, association. I mean, they will, but having both of those guys on the same team means everyone will exponentially look better by association because you're all playing together. This is the part that I think people sometimes tend to miss. Yes, box score and those stats like steals, they do not tell the whole defensive story. That it's a harder story to tell than just looking at who has the most steals and who has the most block shots in the season. I'm not contending that that's the case by which we make a case for defensive. A lot of it is just eye test stuff. A lot of it is just on-court, off-court stuff. A lot of it is just play tracking and understanding schemes and which guys are helping the most and which guys are able to utilize the most out of a system. But to ding Simmons just because he was on the same team with Embiid, I'll tell you in a second why that's not necessarily totally fair, and that he there's some proof to say that he helped Embiid as much as Embiid helped him. So we're in there's a middle ground here when it comes to Simmons. It all points to Simmons helping the Nets defense. Like that. No one should make the contention that this is not one of the better defenders to now kind of come into the Nets. Like he will be one of the better, just kind of on ball guy with size that can guard lots of different positions, that can stay on the court. Like this is clearly a situation that's going to help the Nets defense. How much it helps them, I don't think he takes them from like to an elite defense. He's not that guy, but to contend that he's not going to help, which some people have, is like totally bonkers. We'll get into more of that here in a second. First, are you one of those people that thinks it's okay to drive stoned? What's the worst that can happen? You end up driving below the speed limit. It's no big deal, right? Wrong. The truth is your reaction times slow way down when you're high. You not only put yourself in danger, but everyone around you. Talk about a buzzkill. Stop kidding yourself. It's not okay to drive high. If you've been using marijuana in any form, do not get behind the wheel. If you feel different, you drive different, drive high, get a DUI. All right. Some stats here about the Simmons defense thing. We'll talk about Yuta Watanabe here in a second as well. Jump on with Jackson Gatlin at the tail end of the podcast. If you go back to 2021, and I'll just combine 2021 and 21-22, those two, so the last two seasons. I understand that Simmons did not play for the Sixers here, but it's okay. We get a bigger sample size with Embiid. Wanted to give you some on-off court numbers to help sort of paint a picture of what the Sixers defense was with and without these guys. So in 2021, that season, so 2 seasons ago, I already mentioned the Sixers were second overall in defensive rating. It was kind of them at the Lakers at the top, then a little bit of a dip between Utah and New York, and then like a kind of a bigger dip down to Golden State. If you look at last season, where Simmons does not play with the Sixers drop all the way to 12th overall in defense on the season. Again, not all the same exact parts. I get it. There were some other changes, but there was a notable 10-spot drop in overall play, and Embiid played, MVP level minutes for most of the season. So Embiid was on the team. Still a good defense, but not ranking in that elite category. Again, yes, were there other changes made? Of course. But if we're looking at the anchors and the guys who played the most high leverage minutes and the guys that probably end up contributing the most to the overall defensive effort, it's clear that the Sixers took a hit on defense, not having Ben Simmons on the team. I think that's pretty clear. If you look at the on-off stuff for Embiid and Simmons, now, first of all, when they're on together, it was unbelievable. The 1,164 minutes, 1,164 minutes these guys played together over the last 2 seasons, or that one season because Simmons didn't play. They have a 120 offensive rating and a 104 defensive rating plus 16 net rating. That's sick. Obviously, like it's amazing on offense, and it's even maybe arguably better on defense. They're really, really good. If you look at, so then let's go to what happens when take out when they were playing, but without the other guy. So Embiid with no Simmons, the defense is at 110.86. So obviously a drop off. That was in over 2,700 minutes. A lot of that includes last season when Simmons isn't around. So the defense drops noticeably when Simmons isn't there. Going the offense with Embiid on the court was still really, really good. With Simmons and on the court and Embiid off the court, the defense also drops, but it's only a 1.5 off. So it's 112.28. What does this tell us? This tells us that obviously together, the two guys made up an absolutely elite defense that made it very, very difficult for opponents, right? Like this, we kind of already know. But if you see what happens when they're playing without each other, it's not like Embiid's numbers maintain the super high level and Simmons's didn't. They end up being essentially in the same place. Embiid did affect it more. The team was better on defense with him without Simmons than it was with Simmons without Embiid, if that makes sense. Obviously best when they're both together, but the drop off doesn't end up being like this massive thing that would imply that Joel Embiid is the only reason that the defense was great, as some would contend. Like that is bonkers thinking. We should not think that. The numbers don't really bear that out. If you want to say it's your eye test that bears it out, go ahead. I just said that defense is partly eye test, so or maybe a lot more than partly eye test. So I get it, but there's not like at least on off court numbers in terms of just the overall defensive rating, not the box score counting, just the overall defensive rating, they're going to back that up. So we know that we're getting an elite defender. I just want to put with Simmons and just again push back on this idea that it was only him. Most regular folks are not going to make this contention, right? Like I think most understand that Simmons is going to bring a level of defense for the Nets that they really haven't had over the last few seasons, that they at times have desperately needed. Who was the best defender over the last couple of seasons? Like Bruce Brown was the best defender, Claxton. Like these guys all did an admirable job. There was definitely holes in what they could realistically do in terms of defense, and they're both obviously different players. And then you go back, they had guys that could hold it down to some degree, like the Jeff Greens of the world. And think back to like David Nwaba, who didn't get a long enough look probably in terms of what he was able to do in on-ball defense. But Simmons is still just a different guy than those guys. And he's just going to offer a different level of just sort of like ball hawking, switchability. Again, adding chaos to it. If you just go look at some of the defensive reels from him, you can see that he really, really causes opposing ball handlers a lot of problems when he's totally dialed in. The Nets just haven't had a guy like that over the last couple of years that they've really, really needed. When they had Harden, Kyrie, and Durant rolling for those few minutes they didn't really need tons more on defense because the offense was so great. Obviously, Simmons is not Harden in terms of what he's going to give you on offense, and there's holes in his offensive game. Those holes are mitigated when you play with other elite offensive guys like Durant, like Kyrie Irving, like great shooters in terms of Joe Harris and Seth Curry and guys like that. Like these are just the kind of guys you need to have around Simmons. And I already pointed to it before, for as much as people lamented the problems with Simmons and Embiid on the court together, the regular season, at least numbers in terms of their offensive rating was totally sick. Like they were really good. I know it wasn't the perfect fit in terms of overall basketball stuff, but the numbers still bore out like a very, very high level offensive team. So this is all to say, like I want us to be in a place where we can really start dreaming on the Simmons stuff, like realistically now. I personally was there, but then at the end of the season last season, just couldn't emotionally get all the way there because it was just so unclear of when he was actually going to take the court. During the Durant stuff, it was hard to get too excited about it because it was just unclear what the team was going to look like. Is he going to be traded? He's going to be wrapped up into another package. Like what's going to happen for this team? It was too hard to picture this team, I think. Now that we have the Durant thing a little more set in stone, or a lot more set in stone, I personally am willing to start thinking more actively around the Ben Simmons piece. And that's just an emotional hedging emotionally, hedging rationality wise. That's just where sometimes, at least for me, maybe you're not this way. You have to be when it comes to sports. But with this ironed out, I think it's much, much easier, at least for me, to begin looking at what this team can be. Going to jump on here with Jackson Gatlin in a moment to just talk about some of the high level stuff when it comes to Durant, when it comes to Kyrie, what the team's going to look like. There was a signing here. Shams Charania did report that Yuta Watanabe was the Nets signed him on Sunday. Is this a ground shifting move by the Nets? No, I don't think we're going to spend a ton of time on it. This is now the Nets. The other byproduct of this Kevin Durant thing is the Nets can now fill out the rest of the roster, which they desperately needed to do. They had to keep some roster spots open just because it's just, they weren't sure if they were going to bring back more players than in the Kevin Durant trade and therefore not have enough spots. So they had to kind of wait. And that when that happens, you miss out on some free agency guys because, everyone's got to make their moves and you can't because you're going to end up cutting these guys. He's a 6'9" guy, play a lot of small forward, can range up to the 4, not an overly big guy. This is not your stretch 5, although the Nets can, play him at probably a little higher up than the Raptors were able to do last year because the Raptors already had so many big guys that they were able to cover for him. He shot 35% from 3 over the last couple of years. Point of honesty, I probably watched like 70 total minutes of Yuta Watanabe last year. He did get some starts, mostly COVID related stuff. Did end up playing in 38 games, was on Memphis, but didn't really get too much of a look there. I think this is like a nice kind of guy to take a flyer on when it comes to the Nets, just because he's big. He can shoot the 3. He's not going to be able to bang around the rim tons. Like the rebounding rate for the minutes is fine, 2.5 rebounds per 12 minutes. He's going to be more of he's going to be a wing guy. This is, again, though, a kind of guy that the Nets probably needed to try to sign 2 years last year when we ended up signing, I don't know, just kind of like older, probably a little bit washed guys like the Paul Millsaps, like the James Johnson. Watanabe's 27. You'd much rather them see at this point go after this kind of guy. Does he end up, turning a corner with the Nets? Probably not, but this is the kind of guy you should take flyers on. Like, this is the kind of guy to sort of risk it on and see if you can turn him into something maybe more than he's been up until this point. And we've seen lots of examples of this happening with guys through the course of the NBA. That's just the kind of the way it works. So I like the signing on balance. I'm not going to go off and say that like we've seen so much of him to say that this is like a corner turning move for the Nets. I don't think that's the case, but it represents the right kind of guy that they want to get in the door here. It represents a little bit of floor spacer, a little bit of size, at least in terms of the height. He's got some veteran minutes underneath him in terms of just like he's played in the NBA for a couple of years. He's still available on the free agent wire, and there's reasons for that as well. And so I think that's like a good thing to take into mind. But overall, just in terms of like archetype, in terms of guys that the Nets should be signing, this is definitely the dude. Gonna jump on here with Jackson Gatlin from Locked On NBA, talk a little bit more about what this offseason has been like, what to expect from the Nets going forward. We'll do that right after this.
Joining us now is Doug Norrie from Locked On Nets. You can follow on Twitter at Doug Norrie. Now, Doug, Kevin Durant and the Nets apparently agreeing to move forward together with one collective goal in mind of bringing an NBA championship to Brooklyn. Now, however, tenuous this relationship feels at this current point in time after everything that's been going on the last, couple months, the entire offseason, it pretty much feels like. Does this feel like almost a begrudging agreement, or more so of a turning point in which KD has realized that Brooklyn might, actually be the best situation for him moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I probably is somewhat begrudging. I mean, it's not what he had stated he wanted. Nothing else seemed to have changed on the Nets end of things. So at that point, unless there was some kind of misunderstanding, which you usually don't get to, when it comes to trade requests, short of that, the Nets didn't change their stance at all. They didn't fire the coach. They didn't fire the GM. They didn't make any player personnel movement. They didn't sign Kyrie. I mean, none of that stuff that you would have thought would have been a needle mover for Durant happened. And at least for now, they got into a room and said, this is the best way forward. Look, you're allowed to change your mind about things. I think we live in a society where it's like, if you change your mind, it looks like you're a flip-flopper or it looks like you're weak or anything like that. You're allowed to, at some point, just say, hey, turns out that this might be the best path forward. I don't think that's an ethical or moral indictment of somebody, although it's been framed that way, I think. So I think is it begrudging? I'm sure at some point, but it also just could have been the best option because, when it got down to when rubber met the road on some of these trade demands, what really materialized? Not much. That can be a little humbling too. And so, I don't know, like who knows what happened in this room? I'm sure it wasn't all just like a peace circle with everyone holding hands and doing a lap around the campfire. But these guys are professionals. They've all been in this business and the industry for a long time. And sometimes this is just the way it plays out. And I think that's where we are. So I think it's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and I kind of fully agree with you, right? When presented with new facts, new information, it's totally fine, right? You make a new, more informed decision as to where you were before. And even though it may, maybe there's not a whole ton of new information, maybe just some new perspective kind of on the situation for KD, at least as far as his decision to kind of move forward with the Nets and, rescind his previous trade request. I mean, we'll see how it plays out. But when you look at, obviously we still need to see what this Nets team actually looks like on the floor, whether they can actually kind of piece this whole thing together. But at this point, how much credit should like Sean Marks and Joe Tsai get for kind of navigating this situation and not completely caving to KD's demands earlier on?
Yeah, you have to get a ton of credit based on what happened. Right now, on the one hand, you could say, well, maybe that was some of their own creation. So then you have to walk back some of the credit. Like if you think that some of the blame for it being for Durant asking out falls into their laps, which I think some of it does, at least from the GM standpoint. I think there's a number of missteps and moves that kind of went wrong for the Nets here over the last couple of years. So from that point, it's like hard to get credit for maybe, getting back something that you created. Now, that being said, once the trade demand is made, and you get out of it without making a trade, you have to get credit for that. Like that is there. And I think to some degree that path was forged a little bit by Daryl Morey last year with Ben Simmons. Like they have something of a template to say, hey, when a guy asks out, you're not obligated to just ship him out to the first person that offers a big contract or a big trade package or a trade package too. So I think Morey helped a little bit with that he stood firm on the Simmons thing for basically looked like he was going to go, he would have gone through the deadline. I think he would have stood up for the whole year on the Simmons piece. So I think that helped them. Yeah. And I think, when you have Kevin Durant here, you have to just try everything in your power to keep him around to get him happy. I think that, and if you're able to walk back a trade demand, especially a trade demand that looks like it was tied directly to you and to maybe the coach, and to have none of it changed, you have to compliment someone on being able to do that. That is not an easy needle to thread. They somehow figured it out. And you do get credit for it. I can't give full credit because I do think that they were part of the problem to begin with. And I think Durant maybe was part of the problem too, right? I don't think no one here is coming out completely unscathed. And I think probably that maybe more than anything is probably what informed their decision. It's like, hey, we all kind of don't look great in this. So maybe we can all just come together and come out of this looking better. And the best way for us to look better is just to come back, play with the team we have, which could be absolutely stacked, and move on. And because I think it was becoming increasingly clear that anything else was just maybe that's not going to happen.
Yeah, right. Just get everybody together and say, hey, we can maybe salvage this a little bit, right? Like there's going to be some tough pills to swallow as far as just what this is kind of looking like, what people are going to be able to look back on, how this offseason transpired. But still, that is important that they were able to kind of come together to that decision, at least at this point. And the timing of this decision, right, Doug? Like, I mean, how important was it to just come to this conclusion, right? To iron this out before training camp, before the season started, right? Because this could have gone one of two ways, right? This could have dragged on throughout training camp, possibly into the early part of the season. And at least at this stage, right, this gives the Nets the best chance to actually try to run this thing back with KD and prove, hey, like we are still a good situation for you.
Yeah, look, I think when you look at how the decision tree or the if statements were kind of branching out here the longer it went on, the worse it was also going to be for everybody, right? Because, and this goes back to how long are we going to play this out for? Or we're all in a weird spot. The trade packages that are coming back for you presumably aren't even close, right? So because we never heard about, short of the Jaylen Brown offer, we never heard of anything else really formal around what a team offered. So, and they can just present that to KD and say, hey, these were the packages. We can't accept this for you. You have 4 more years in the contract. You're Kevin Durant. It's just not reasonable to accept. So they can actually present maybe real world thing. And these guys all know too, like the agents and everything. I know that front offices talk. These agents are usually as part of the process as anybody else, right? Because that's just the way the NBA ecosystem works at this point. So you have with all the information on the table, the trade packages aren't good enough. Now, that being said, what are we going to do? Are we going to get all the way to training camp? You are going to come back to a team you don't want to play for? That doesn't look great. How can we put you on the court? Like if you don't want to be on the team. So that, in Kevin Durant's eyes, that can start looking bad too. And on the Nets' point of view, it's like, hey, we're going to have an unhappy guy. We can't make any more roster moves. We can't do anything. We're all just stuck. The theme for this whole summer, basically from the time that Durant put in the trade request, which was just stuck. No one could move. The Nets could not make any other roster moves. The Nets could not move forward and try to plan it all. Durant has to just not know which team he's on. And if it's never looking like it's going to get close, what changes that between now and training camp? Nothing. These teams, if anything, I think maybe what happened was, hey, we're not helping each other at all here. I don't think this is over. Like, I don't think Kevin Durant is here for 4 more years. I would not make a life bet on that at all. I think probably something that was said was, let's go into the season. Let's walk down this hallway all together, look like we're all together. And let's evaluate as the season goes up to the trade deadline. You play your hardest. You might find out that this team's very good and you want to keep playing. It could all implode. And at that point, we'll just revisit the trade at the deadline. But we can't do that. We can't do that from a point of strength unless it looks like we're all trying now. I think if anything, that's probably what was said. It's like, hey, let's just all give each other another shot. You're free to just ask for a trade again. You already did it once. Like, you can do it again. I can see that more than anything have been the scenario, because what else could, like, they're just, like I said, everyone was just stuck. And then the way that the pattern was kind of unfolding, there was going to be no change. And this looked like might have been the only way.
Yeah, and if you've got KD sitting out for a chunk of the beginning of the season, then the trade leverage just goes even further and further down. And then suddenly again, neither side is getting what they want. KD is still in Brooklyn. No possible trade packages are coming forward. Yeah, it's a lose-lose situation. At least this way, it looks like a potential win-win situation if there is still a split pending further down the line. But Doug, in all of this, right? Again, KD headlines everywhere, all KD. There's still one other pretty sizable domino to try and figure out moving forward for this Nets team, and that's what happens with Kyrie Irving, right? The Nets declined to extend him to begin the offseason. That was one of KD's whole demands, things that kind of everybody thought was going to happen to make KD happy. That didn't happen. I mean, are the Nets just kind of expecting Kyrie to just show back up to work and play his heart out, or is that kind of the next okay, finally, KD's situation taken care of, and then they turn their attention, they're like, all right, what do we got to do with Kyrie now?
Well, in the Nets' favor here, they have done all the right things, quote unquote, with Kyrie in this offseason. He's been a big part of their promotional stuff. Like he's had, there's been no controversy around him. His stuff is usually not of the typical NBA controversy stuff. It's usually just kind of out of left field things, but there's been nothing even like that. It's been, if you follow Nets sort of just the social media stuff, it's been a lot of Kyrie centric stuff. He does a lot of camps. He does a lot of stuff over the summer. And they have highlighted a lot of that. And so, from that point of view, that relationship for a 1-year relationship, because it hasn't been re-signed at this point, looks pretty good. The Nets also needed to market something because with Durant unsure, someone's got to go on the court that people want to buy tickets for. And Kyrie Irving, when he plays, is definitely one of those dudes. So I think from the Nets perspective, all that stuff has been pretty positive. It doesn't make sense to have it go any other way. His stance, it seems very positive right now. Like this relationship looks like they might be somewhat on the same page about, and it's funny, like it's all about sort of like value, just getting the value back to where it should be, right? Like Kyrie Irving's value has clearly declined a little bit here based on other things. The way to get that back up is to have everyone kind of looking like they're on the same page and playing well. Like I think even no matter what you think of Kyrie, that is a very clear thing that needs to happen. And I think that has been happening for him. And so I think that I don't know if this means they're going to see a long-term contract come down the door. This could have been, or come down the pike. I think this could have also been something that was discussed and said, hey, he's part of our future now. We just got to come to the agreement on the terms. Like who knows? But I think right now, another theme for the Nets is let's all have it appear as if it's on the up and up. And if we have it appear it's on the up and up, it might just be on the up and up and we'll be a good team going forward. Like that appearances can also mirror reality. So I think that's sort of where they are now is like, get on the court, get that value back up, show that you're, one of the top guards like ever to play basketball, which is what he really is when he's firing all cylinders. And then we'll revisit a longer deal here in a little bit, or like, and that will be the case. Or worst case scenario, your value's back up and you'll get re-signed. You'll sign with someone else for the max contract at the end of the year. Like we can all help each other, even if we don't like each other. I do think that's probably where they are with Kyrie here too, with the understanding, if it all goes right, the Nets will be awesome. That's the other thing here too. Like if it all goes correct with the Nets, if it all plays out on paper like it could, this team could be amazing, especially on offense. And I think that's an easy selling point to sell to players too sometimes, is that like, hey, come back, play your hardest. We have other good players here. If it all works, we'll be really good. If it doesn't work, you'll at least get your value back up a little bit and we'll be able to trade you to a more advantageous situation. So we can all just help each other, even if the end goal is like not the championship down the line because it didn't go right. I think in that way, I think the Kyrie situation does kind of mirror the Durant situation.
I mean, how good can this Nets team be on paper? If they can get all these guys kind of bought in again together, how long does the at least tentative partnership and agreement with Kevin Durant last? Is it a temporary fixture, or is it something where KD truly is bought into trying to win a title in Brooklyn? You're gonna have us covered for all of that and more over at Locked On Nets. Doug, I appreciate you stopping by Locked On NBA with me.
Awesome, thanks a lot.